Good afternoon, everyone. It is Wednesday, February 22nd, 2023. And how the heck is February almost over already? I mean, I get how time works, and I know I seem to say that a lot, but maybe it's because I'm getting a little older. I don't know, but it feels like time is just speeding by. I can't believe it's almost March already, particularly looking out the window and it's snow. So, that's fun. Anyway, not what we're here to talk about today. Today, you will find out what would have happened had I followed my inclination that I had at one point to get my PhD in history and become a history professor, because that's what I want to talk about today is history and women. And I know some of you are probably going, why? Because it's important is why, honestly, because we need to think about how are women being portrayed in history? How are women being acknowledged in history? How are women being remembered and how are they being forgotten? That's important. So history nerd me thought this would be a fun topic. And since I like to do shows that I think are interesting, this is one that I decided to do. And hopefully it will be interesting to some of the rest of you. I guess we will find out. But let's start off with some discussion about why women aren't represented in history as much as they maybe could have been or should have been. And the first reason for that, and you had to know there was going to be some analysis here. I mean, come on, people. The first reason is who writes history? And for centuries and centuries, the people who wrote history were men. And so if women did get mentioned, they generally got mentioned as they were affecting or connected to men. And you have to remember, for a long swathe of history, women didn't have education. They often couldn't write, they couldn't read, they weren't allowed to get educated. And so a lot of times it was thought to be a waste of time to educate a woman. So they didn't have the means to write histories. So the only histories that they could pass on really were oral. And oral histories, unless people are very, very dedicated in keeping those alive, or unless they happen to come to the ears of someone who feels that it's worth writing it down, can often get lost. And history was recorded by men. And for a long time, those men were monks or connected with the church, Catholic or otherwise, depending on what time in history it was. And those people, that institution, tended for a lot of history to not think very highly of women, to not really care about women's stories, to not really think much of women in general. So if you are a monk and you are predisposed to think that women are the root of all evil, you're not going to bother to record their stories. That's just reality. And if you are in a society where women are not educated or really allowed to get an education, then the women don't have the means to write down their own stories. So what comes down to us through history is either women's stories as interpreted by the men who were writing the history, or no stories about women at all. And that's not a commentary on anything necessarily. That's just the reality of the situation. The people who have the ability to get educated, have the ability to learn to read and write, are the people who are going to record the history that has the best chance of getting down to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation and so on. Otherwise, no, it's not going to happen. So that's one of the things that I think people don't take into account in a couple of ways. One is, if you're the person who's writing the history, you're probably going to be more inclined to record the history of people who are like you. Which means, and people who are the movers and shakers in society, which again, For a lot of time, women were confined to the home. They were confined to basically being mothers or wives. They didn't really have a lot of influence on the outside world. Now, that's not historically across the board. There are always women who have done things. But for the most part, that was a smaller group. So if you're the guy who's looking for the good story to save to make sure future generations know, you're probably not going to write, Marjorie made a great cake today. You're going to write about the things that happened that you think are interesting and noteworthy. And those are usually battles or kings or things like that. The stories of men are the stories that would have impacted or seemed to impact the future of things the most. So those are the stories that people tended to write down. And that's just, again, not men are evil and didn't talk about women. That's not what I'm saying. It's just human nature is that you're going to record the stories of the big events, which women really weren't allowed to participate in, or you're going to record the stories of the people who are most like you. And if the prevailing attitude of your particular era is that women are evil, or women should be seen and not heard, or women are only good for being mothers and wives, or whatever it is, then you're not going to bother with recording their stories, because what importance would they have, really? So I think whenever we're looking at why are women not really seen as much in history as maybe they should be, in proportion to the fact that they're, half of the people on the planet or more in some cases, you have to look at who's writing the history, what the circumstances of the time were, and whether or not really women even had access to be able to record their own history. I mean, you have to remember there were times in our world where women couldn't write a book and publish it under their own name. They had to pretend to be a guy, or they had to have their brother take it to the publisher, or whatever it was. There were times not that long ago where women couldn't own property, where women couldn't have custody of their children, all this kind of stuff. So if you're disenfranchised in every other way, it stands to reason that your history is probably going to be a little disenfranchised too. Sad, but true. So that's one thing that we really need to look at, is who is writing the history. Because the people, and there's that old saying that, history is written by the victors. Very true. History is written by the people who have the power. If you don't have the power, you don't have the ability to write the history. That's just reality. So for a long time, women had very minimal power, if any. And you can make the argument, yeah, there were queens and but queens were mostly queen's consort, and they didn't really, their power was all domestic. It wasn't, for the most part. There are exceptions. You can make exceptions for every rule. And I don't want to argue semantics here. I'm just saying, for the most part, even the women who would have been considered powerful or notable were often not educated. And often, if they did have any sort of power, it was power granted by someone else, and power that is granted by someone else can be taken away by someone else if you offend. So there you go. Another reason that women often don't show up in history has often been about conquest. If you think about your history classes when you were in, 11th grade or 10th grade or whatever it was, and you studied, and it seemed like everything that you learned was the date of a battle or the site of a battle or what happened at a battle. And that's true, because for a lot of history, battles were very consequential. Wars were very consequential. Territory changed hands. someone very influential died in a battle, whatever it was. So history has often been about war. It's been about conquest. It's been about territories changing hands. And think about this: who fights in the wars? Who's allowed to fight in the wars? Women still aren't allowed to fight on the front lines of wars. So, other than Joan of Arc, I suppose, and maybe Boudica or Boudica, however one pronounces her name, I never quite know. I've seen different versions of it. For those who don't know, Boudica was a queen in Britannia, Roman Britain, and she led a rebellion against the Romans and got pretty far before she was quite gruesomely killed. But so we know about her and we know about Joan of Arc. But other than that, there really aren't a lot of women who fought in wars. I mean, yeah, we know of the odd person, Molly Pitcher in the Revolutionary War. There were probably women who went to the Civil War. There have probably been women who have been involved in some roundabout way in almost any war. But you probably don't know a lot about it. I mean, if you know about it, you know the one story that probably is an apocryphal story and maybe not the entire truth. And that's all you know. So when you think about it, if you're writing a history of conquest and conquest is mostly male, the wars are fought between men, men lead the wars, men make the wars for the most part, then yeah, you're not going to hear much about women because women weren't really there. And when you do hear about women in the context of war, you hear about them in a very specific kind of saintly or motherly sort of image. Let's take Florence Nightingale, for instance. Florence Nightingale is famous for being a nurse. You might have heard her called the Lady of the Lamp or the Lady with the Lamp. And she took a bunch of nurses to the Crimean War. And this was the first time that nurses had ever been deployed in a war situation. She went there and found that the hospital situation that was set up was horrible. Men were dying. Quite a lot of men were dying. The hygiene was terrible. The conditions were awful. And she put her nurses to work. She put out a call and got a lot of supplies and got things done and helped reduce the death rate, and was also a marvelous statistician and founded a nursing school and did all this stuff. But really, if you look at the history of what we get told about her, it's the saintly lady with the lamp walking around at night looking after and comforting the wounded soldiers. That's probably the most famous image. And it's not a bad image. It's not a wrong image. It's just an image that's kind of leaving out half of the story and putting her in this little box of what a woman is supposed to be, which in Victorian times, which is when she was operating, was women are supposed to be about hearth and home. They're supposed to be about all the saintly things in life. They're supposed to be about, mediating and being kind and being good and all this stuff. Women were essentially considered the civilizing influence, basically. So again, if most of your history is about conquest and war, you're not going to write a lot about the people who are bringing peace or supposed to be bringing peace. And if you do write about them, you're going to put them in this little box of what a woman is supposed to be. So while Florence Nightingale did many, many things, like I said, most of what you know about her, have heard about her, is her being a motherly, comforting figure to these soldiers, which, not to negate that, because that's a huge thing. But she did a lot of other stuff too. And it would be nice to have a well-rounded picture of all the stuff that she did. And we don't often get that. We tend to get women as stereotypes rather than women as real people. And I think that's sometimes a failing of history a little bit, but I still like history. I'm just saying I think we could do better by women and people of color too. Something to think about. So, another aspect of history that often crops up is women in relation to men. When you do hear about historical women, you most often hear about them as the sister, the mother, the wife, the girlfriend, whatever it is, in relation to a famous man. And that used to be really how it was. You were somebody's daughter, and then you were somebody's wife. And that was how it went. And again, that's half the story. Like, okay, let's take, for instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Queen, she was married to, gosh, I want to say Henry II. I could be wrong about that, but I think I'm right. She was first married to the King of France, Louis, and then she got an annulment from him because she didn't really like him, and he had been raised very religious, and he didn't really like sex, and supposedly she was really hot-blooded and really was into sex, which we'll talk about that in the next point. But she ended up getting an annulment from him. She had initially been married to him because she had been the heir to Aquitaine, which was this huge duchy in what is now France, basically. And she controlled the property back then because her father had died and had only had girls, and she was the eldest girl. So she inherited the duchy, which made her hugely rich, hugely important, gave her a lot of power. So because she was female and had no older male relatives to keep her safe or help her, she had to get married. That was kind of how it worked. So she married Louis. Louis was very monkish. He had been a second son who was never supposed to be king. He was raised to kind of be religious and be a monk or be a priest. And then his older brother died, and he ended up being king. And he was not a dynamic man. He was not a real go-getter. And they didn't really mesh, let's put it that way. And they also only had daughters. They had 2 daughters over a span of a number of years. They did not have a son. And so eventually it was decided that, they were related in the prohibited degree, which was a thing back then, a religious thing, that if you were related within certain degrees of, you shared the same great grandparents or whatever, excuse me, then you were related too closely and it was a sin and you shouldn't be married. And supposedly God would then stop you from having children and all this stuff. So they ended up getting divorced, and she turned right around, and she had, of course, sworn up and down to Louis, I'm going to go back to my duchy. I'll still be loyal to you. I'm not going to do anything that's going to upset the balance of power. And then she turned around immediately and married Henry II. I think it's Henry II. And upset the balance of power hugely because he was King of England or was soon to be King of England. And so she allied Aquitaine with him, and he turned out to be a really good war leader. And so he conquered a bunch more territory, and they had a very big empire, so to speak. But really the only way you hear about her is what comes across as important about her a lot of the time is her marriages. She married Louis, and then she married Henry. And the fact that she was the heiress to this huge property, but at that time, she couldn't just live in her duchy and run it. She had to marry somebody to be protected, which is kind of sucky when you think about it. But, it is what it is. So even though she's a very interesting person and she did a lot of stuff, and for a woman of her time period, which was the 1200s, 1300s, something like that. She did a lot. She was regent of England. She ran her duchy. She supported her sons when they rebelled against her husband, which he ended up ultimately imprisoning her for like 15 years or something. So she had a quite expansive life for the time period. But still, when we hear about we hear about her in relation to her husbands. She was the queen of Louis. She was the queen of Henry. And that's really why anything she did is recorded. We don't hear about women often as themselves on their own. We hear about them because they're the queen of someone, or they're the wife of someone, or which a queen is a wife essentially. Or they're the sister of someone, or they're the daughter of someone, or whatever it is. And it's always about the woman's relationship to the man. And often the women are portrayed as helpmeets. The women are portrayed as, women who did very substantial things to get, just let's talk about composers for a minute. The number of composers' wives who were instrumental in helping the composers get music done, or who even wrote some of the music for the composers and never got credit for it, is pretty huge. And still you hear about them as, yes, he married her and she had these children and she was a helpmeet to him, and that's lovely and great and fine and whatever, but it's not the whole story. And you shouldn't have to only hear about women in relation to the men in their lives. I mean, let's take, Louisa May Alcott, for instance. Louisa May Alcott wrote probably one of the most famous books ever, which is Little Women. And still, a lot of the time when you hear talk about her, it's either about who her father was, Alcott Bronson, who was quite famous in his time. He's less famous now, but there's still discussion of he was a transcendentalist, and he did all these wacky schemes, and he ran a school, and he had a method of teaching that was very humanistic and kind of holistic, and he treated children like they were children and not little adults, which was very weird for the time. But you hear about how she's his daughter, and so a lot of what she does is because of him, or about the friends she had. She knew Thoreau, she knew Walden, she knew a lot of very influential people of the time period. And so you'll hear about her in relation to those men. And you don't really hear about her necessarily as her. And I mean, this woman sat down and wrote one of the probably most influential books out there, or certainly one of the most long-lived. I think probably almost everybody has heard of Little Women in some form or another, and there have been multiple movies of it and all this other stuff. It's had legs. It's a good story. And I think we shortchange her when we only talk about who her father was, who her male friends were, what her romantic life was like, which we talk about, that gets talked about too, and not talk about her ambition or her writing practices or what she went through to get her books published, or the fact that she basically supported her own family. And let's not even get started on her mother, who was, her father put her mother through all this stuff, but you don't hear a lot about her mother because her mother was just the mother, which she really wasn't. She was very influential on Louisa. She was very influential in keeping the family afloat because the father was kind of head in the clouds, offended a lot of people, seemed to have a talent for finding a good situation and screwing it up. So there's a lot of this stuff that you look at and go, oh, you know what? I'd like to know more about what her thought process was. How did she write? What did she go through? What were her ambitions? Instead of hearing all this stuff about, well, she knew Nathaniel Hawthorne, or she knew Walden, or she was romantically possibly involved with Thoreau. And I could have mixed those two up, but something like that. And I think, and yeah, don't get me wrong, I like a good romantic story as much as the next person. I like a good speculation about these two could have been involved as much as the next person. It's interesting, but it's not the only thing women are about. And that brings me to my next point, which is when we do hear about women, a lot of time it's all about sex, baby. And if you're hearing that little sting in your head right now, well, thank you. Or you're welcome, I guess. That's what I heard about it that's what I heard as soon as I typed it. So a lot of times when we hear about women, it's because of their beauty or because they were involved in what the people who were writing at the time considered salacious things. Cleopatra, good example. What do you know about her? If somebody says Cleopatra to you, probably you're going to say, oh, she was lovers with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Which, yeah. But there was so much more to this woman. I mean, she was trying to preserve a kingdom. She was smart. She wrote poetry. She spoke the language of her people, which her family was Greek. So she was very educated for the time, and she was very, very smart. She was also very strategic. She was tap dancing basically in a fire, trying to keep Rome from taking over Egypt, trying to pick the right side when Antony and Octavian were fighting after Caesar had been killed. She was trying to do all this stuff to preserve her kingdom, to protect her people. And so, yeah, one of the weapons that she had at her disposal was, hey, maybe these powerful guys want to sleep with me. But that's not the only part of the story. That's not the only thing about her that matters, but that's probably the only thing that most of us know about her. And there is an amazing biography about Cleopatra by, I want to say the woman's name is Stacy Schiff. And if you're interested at all in history and Cleopatra, find that biography and read it. I own a copy of it. It's amazing. And she really gets into the events of the time and how Cleopatra was navigating it all. And it's a really, really good story. And Cleopatra becomes a very much more dimensional person in this book. Let's take another woman in history that we mostly know for being pretty, Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr was an actress in the 30s and 40s. Beautiful woman. I mean, she really is a beautiful woman, and she was a decent actress. But that is not all that she did. She was instrumental in creating the technology that led to GPS, led to satellites, led to Wi-Fi, led to various things. She started creating this technology in World War II. She wanted to help against torpedoes that were being fired by submarines. And she wanted to figure out a way to jam the torpedoes. And the problem was that they were only using one, if I remember this correctly, and I could be off a little bit on this. The problem was that the ships were only using one form of radar and one frequency of radar, and the torpedoes could lock onto it and then find the ship and blow it up. So Hedy started working on a way to vary the frequency so that the torpedoes couldn't lock and then couldn't hit the ship. So the army didn't really grab onto it at the time. They turned back around later and took it and used it for creating other things, did not credit her for it. And I don't think, though I could be mistaken about this, but I don't think she ever got paid for it, which is, when you think about it, pretty crappy on the part of the US government. But there you go. So she was instrumental in developing the technology that became Wi-Fi, that became GPS, that was used for satellites, that has been used for a variety of different things. And she basically never got any money out of it or never got any credit out of it. And if you ask most people if they even know the name of Hedy Lamarr, because again, she was a movie star in like the 30s and 40s, basically. Um, if they know anything about her, they probably know that, and that's it. So she's known for kind of being this really gorgeous woman, and she's not known at all for the fact that she had this amazing brain that figured out all these things that led to all these inventions that we now take for granted and use every day. So we tend to put women in this box of sex. Are they pretty? Who are they sleeping with? You know, is it salacious? Is it scandalous? Do we need to know about it because, you know, it's fun to know about all these dirty little details about people. And that's all we know about them. We don't know about their brains. We don't know about the things they might have done. I mean, Hedy Lamarr, come on. She invented a lot of amazing stuff, but we don't know about that. Cleopatra was a brilliant strategist. We don't know about that. We know about the fact that she rolled herself up in a carpet and had herself delivered to Julius Caesar to try to seduce him, supposedly. So I think we need to treat women as well-rounded people. We need to treat them as people who have more stories and more interest than what they look like or who they're sleeping with. Because that's never the whole story. And I also think we should examine the fact that women are not always, I don't want to say always, women are often the villains in these stories too, in terms of, well, she tempted him, or she led him astray or something. And yeah, sometimes that's probably true, but I don't think it's true as often as it's said. So I think that's also incumbent on us to try to get the whole story. If we do want to read the salacious stuff, what's the whole story? How does it all work? So the next thing I want to talk about, and I'm sorry my voice is just not playing nice today. I've had a bit of a cold, and apparently my voice has decided to remind me of that. The next thing I want to talk about is something that is an event in history that really impacted women, that I would give you even odds that most women have never heard of and don't know about. I happened to find out about it because I stumbled across a book by accident called The Trials of Nina McCall by Scott Stern, I believe is the author. And I knew nothing about this. And it was shocking and kind of scary. And I was like, oh, this is, why don't we know about, why don't we study this in school? Why isn't this part of our history class? Why don't we know this? Well, because it's a blot on American history, basically, but it's important. So I want to tell you about it. This is something called the American Plan. The American Plan was developed started about 1919, 1918. And the reason that it was developed was because of World War I. And what happened in World War I was there were a lot of soldiers going to bases in the United States to be trained before they were sent over to wherever they were going to fight. And the Army started noticing that a lot of their soldiers were getting what they would have called back then VD, what we would call now sexually transmitted diseases or sexually transmitted infections, STDs or STIs. But the Army noticed this, that a lot of their soldiers, a lot of their soldiers were getting these infections, these STIs. And they decided something needs to be done to fix this. How do we stop the soldiers from going out and having unprotected sex and getting these infections? So, of course, they tried telling them not to do it, which worked about as well as you would assume. So, they decided to put in force a series of laws which came to be known as the American Plan. And they encouraged most states to pass these laws. And the laws on the books said any person who is suspected of having a STD, an STI, whatever you want to call it, can be pulled in and tested and perhaps incarcerated for treatment if they indeed turn out to have a sexually transmitted disease. Any person and suspected. Those are the bits that you need to pay attention to. So theoretically, this law covered both men and women. Theoretically. In practice, it was used against women almost exclusively, which means that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of women were pulled off the street or pulled from their homes or taken from their families, incarcerated against their will, given invasive and often painful tests, and then given treatments that were dangerous, sometimes harmful, sometimes painful, and could be incarcerated for lengths of time that were not set. So it could be as long as whoever was holding them decided that they wanted to hold them. Now, like I said, the language of the law said anyone. So theoretically, you would assume men would be pulled in as much as women. In actual fact, men almost never were pulled in under the American Plan. It was all women. So, and women got pulled in and put in jail. They got pulled in and confined to insane asylums. They got pulled in for no reason other than they pissed somebody off. They'd made somebody angry. And that person decided you look like somebody that has a problem. They got pulled in for walking down the street at night. They got pulled in for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They got pulled in for going on a date, for being seen kissing a man, for any number of things that were like the shabbiest pretexts ever. So it wasn't just people that you would maybe fight, but I'm saying if you were a sex worker or something, then okay. Excuse me. That would make a little bit of sense. That, potentially if you're doing a lot of sex work, you might have a sexually transmitted disease, particularly back then when contraception wasn't as prevalent or as easy to obtain. Other, protection wasn't talked about as much. So you would think, okay, that would make sense. But no, these were mothers, these were wives, these were, ordinary women off the street who were pulled away from their lives, basically, made to submit to these painful and degrading tests, and then often held for weeks, if not months, for treatments that often didn't work and sometimes were harmful. And nobody knew anything about this. And nobody ever talks about it. And what really is scary and kind of creepy is that a lot of these laws were on the books in certain states until the 1970s. So this wasn't like it was a short-lived thing and then everybody went, oh, this is not right. We should maybe not do this. And then they stopped. No. So if you were a woman who the people in power, who for most of our history would have been men, decided for whatever the reason that you weren't living the right lifestyle or you weren't behaving the right way or whatever it is, they could pick you up under the American plan. They could incarcerate you. They could test you against your will for a sexually transmitted infection. And then they could treat you with treatments that usually couldn't cure you and might actually harm you. And then they could, when they decided that you were rehabilitated or they decided to let you go, they could send you back to your life, which, you could have lost your job. You could have issues with family members or your husband or whoever it was. And that was it. You didn't get compensation. You didn't get anything. Now, the woman who is discussed in Scott Stern's book, Nina McCall, she actually went to trial a couple of times to try to get some justice for the fact that she was pulled off the street, accused of having an STD, pulled away from her family, incarcerated in a mental institution for, I don't even remember how long, but it was a while, given treatments that were actually harmful to her health, and then, kind of shoved out the door and back into the wreckage of her life. And she thought that was wrong. And she went to court a couple of times and basically got no justice. It's really kind of sad. And here's the part that I find the most alarming about all this. I mean, there's a lot of this that is alarming. But the part that I find the most alarming is that I'd never heard of this. I didn't know this ever happened. I'd never heard of it in a history class. I'd never seen it in a history book. I mean, not even a passing mention when we were talking about World War I. Nothing. So all these women were pulled off the street, incarcerated, and then just dumped back into their lives. And we were never taught about it. We never knew that this happened. And here's why that bugs me, because if you know that this stuff is possible, if you know that these things can happen, we all kind of live in this world where we say, oh, well, it wouldn't happen in my country, or, oh, the people where I live never would have done that. Well, people all over the United States, in every state, and pretty much every county had their own little American Plan group that was responsible for picking up the women in their area, was doing this. And it took a really long time for there to start to be a backlash. And it basically became women who were more prominent and perhaps more safe from this sort of persecution, who stood up and said, this is wrong. You shouldn't do this. And eventually it didn't stop, but it slowed down. It went underground a little bit. And then basically everybody kind of just picked up their shovels and tried to bury the whole thing. Like, shh, don't tell anybody and nobody will know. It's kind of like the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II, which America didn't talk about for years and years and still doesn't talk about a lot. That's horrible. We took a whole race of people and confined them to basically prison camps. That's horrible. But we don't talk about it because it isn't a nice view of our country. It isn't a nice view of America. And that's why learning about this stuff is important. That's why women's history is important, because part of women's history is persecution, wrongful incarceration, being targeted because you're female, being targeted because you're an easy target. And we need to know about that stuff. We need to know that it happens, because the only way to stop it from happening again is to know that it happened in the first place. And if you, like me, are wondering, okay, if the problem was that soldiers were going out and getting STDs, and the aim was to stop the soldiers from going out and getting STDs, why were we not picking up and testing soldiers? That's a really good question. And the answer to that question is, I think, that women are considered to be the root of the problem. Women are the sexual ones. Women are the temptresses, whatever it is. And men are just poor little, lambs to the slaughter, so to speak, which is crap, and we all know it. But that was the prevailing attitude. So seriously, I put on the Women in Business Facebook page a link to an article about this that also references the book that I mentioned. The book is long. There's a lot in it. It's not like the most fascinating book ever, I will say, but it's worth reading just because this is a part of history that I think every woman needs to know. Because if we're secure in our country would never do something like that, we need to think again, because our country has done something like that. And what's been done once can be done again. I'm not trying to be alarmist here. I'm just saying those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Something to think about. So, another reason why women don't show up in history a lot is laws restricting societal rights. This is another thing in history we don't talk about a lot. If you talk about historical women, you often get, well, in Victorian times, it was the saint of the household, and the saint of the hearth, or whatever it was. Well, that was because women couldn't do anything else. They couldn't go to college. They couldn't own property. They couldn't sign contracts. They often didn't even have custody of their own kids. So what the hell else were they going to do? Excuse my language. They basically had to stay home because that was their option. And so when we talk about, well, women in history didn't do a lot, or maybe history doesn't talk about women because women didn't do much, a lot of times it's because women didn't have the ability to do much. I mean, look at when women got the right to vote in America, 1920. That's 103 years ago. That's not that long when you look at the whole history of America. In England, it was, I believe, 1918. Considering how long England has been around, Great Britain's been around since like 1707, but England had been around since much, much longer than that. And women only got the right to vote in 1918. Now, granted, okay, the current form of English government hasn't been around as long, but it's been around since like the 1200s, 1300s, something like that. That's a long, long time that women had no say in how their government went. So you have to take that into account when you're looking at why history doesn't talk about women. A lot of it is because for a long time, women didn't have the right to do anything that had historical impact. If you can't get educated, if you can't vote, if you can't fight, if you can't work, if you can't own property, if you can't sign a contract, how do you get recorded in history? It's a really good question. Really good question. So that's something, I mean, that could be a whole show on it in and of itself, but I did want to mention that because I think it is important. And you also have to look at who gets remembered. The people who get remembered are the people who do things. As I was just pointing out, women weren't allowed to do a lot of stuff. And if they were allowed to do stuff, it was mostly in the context of being a mother, a wife, or a sister, or a daughter. And so that's how they get remembered. The people who write large on the pages of history are the people who have the ability and the autonomy to actually do things. So that's something you need to think about too. It's another answer to the question, why aren't women in history as much? And why don't we hear about women's history as much? You also have to, again, follow back to who's writing the history. The people who write the history decide what gets remembered and what doesn't. Something else to think about. And before we go, real quick, I do just want to mention a couple of women who really kind of got shafted by history a little bit and should be remembered. First one, if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures, you know these three names: Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson. They were Black women who worked for NASA. They were called computers, which basically means they were mathematicians. And they helped figure out the math for the first humans to go to the moon, for the first humans to go into space, and basically were not credited for any of it. Now, granted, Hidden Figures came out and there was a little bit of a renaissance in getting to know who they were, but that was, sometime after they should have been remembered and being talked about and written about. Another one, Lise Meitner, who was a physicist. She helped discover and explain nuclear fission. She was instrumental in doing that. Her collaborator, Otto Hahn, male, won the Nobel Prize in 1944 for that discovery. She did not, and was not, so far as I'm aware, even mentioned when the prize was awarded. So that kind of sucks. Another scientist who got shafted, Rosalind Franklin, who was instrumental in helping to discover the structure of DNA. She also is, I believe, the person who made the first photograph of what DNA looks like. Her discoveries were used by 3 scientists named Crick, Watson, and Wilkins, and it was admitted later that her photographs and discoveries were instrumental in helping them formulate their theories. They won the 1962 Nobel Prize. She died of cancer and basically has gone down into obscurity until recently. Henrietta Lacks, if you've read the book, I think it's The Secret Life of Henrietta Lacks, or the something life of Henrietta Lacks. I don't remember exactly what it is, but there's a book about her. She was a Black woman who had ovarian cancer, and doctors took some of her genetic material for testing and discovered that the cells grew really, really well, and they made a great medium for all sorts of tests of drugs and new therapies and all sorts of things. So they took her genetic material and propagated it and made millions and millions and millions of cells. Did not compensate her for it, didn't even tell her about it, and used these cells to create a variety of therapies and medicines and all sorts of stuff that is just made millions and millions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies and hospitals and scientific labs and all this stuff. And it's all her genetic material, which was taken without her consent or even knowledge, really, and propagated for all these years. That's wrong. Shouldn't have happened. Now, granted, a lot of good came out of it. You can make that argument, but it's still wrong. And that leads to a whole nother discussion of, who owns your genetic material and what should be done with it and all that kind of stuff. And again, that's a whole nother show and probably for another podcast because it doesn't really fit in with the subject of this one. Last person, Gerda Taro, who was a war photographer who died in Spain in 1937. She was the partner of Robert Capa, who was and is a very well-known war photographer. She was a brilliant photographer, but a lot of her work has been published under his name, and she is not recognized. So there are stories like that, if you go looking for them, almost everywhere. And the reason I'm telling you all this, if you're wondering, is because if we want to stop this from happening, we need to start telling these stories. We need to make sure we're telling younger women and young girls these stories. We need to make sure these stories get out there. We need to support efforts to tell these stories. All of this. Buy the books, watch the documentaries, go to the museums, listen to the talks, do all this stuff. Help get women's history out there. And thus ends the lecture for today. If you were in college in a class with me, you could now go and have a latte at the student union. Thank you all for being here today. I will see you all next week. I am working on lining up some more guests, and hopefully I will be able to do that soon. And I will talk to you next Wednesday.